In 1718, a French officer pointed at a swamp and thought he could build a city there. His engineers told him the ground was too soft. His superiors in France called it reckless. Over the next 85 years, that decision kept getting tested. The city burned twice, flooded more times than anyone bothered counting, and changed colonial hands 3 times. Every single time, they rebuilt it in the same spot. I used AI to reconstruct how that city took shape, drawing on historical maps, colonial-era illustrations, and period photographs. So let's get into it. And if you enjoy what you see, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Here is what Bienville saw when he looked at this location, and why it was worth building a city on a swamp. The crescent bend he chose sat roughly 100 miles up the Mississippi from the Gulf of Mexico, close enough to control every ship coming in from the sea, far enough inland to survive an ocean storm. Behind the settlement, Lake Pontchartrain gave the French a second water route to the north. Between the lake and the river, Native American traders had been using a short overland path for generations. Bienville knew Louisiana better than almost any other European alive, and he understood immediately what those two connections meant. Whoever held this specific piece of ground controlled the movement of goods across an entire continent. That was the argument for it. Now here is the argument against. The ground between the river and the lake was not ground in any useful sense. It was silt, river-deposited mud so soft that standing still on it, you could feel it shift slightly under your weight. Spanish moss hung from cypress trees, standing in several feet of standing water. Alligators moved through the shallows at the edge of the settlement. The air was thick with mosquitoes carrying diseases nobody yet understood, yellow fever and malaria, that would kill a significant portion of everyone who tried to live here for the next century. The French engineers who surveyed the site told Bienville the soil could not support permanent construction. He named it La Nouvelle Orléans, after Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, then Regent of France, and started building anyway, which is when the real problem became clear. Before a single building could go up, they had to fight the river. The Mississippi at flood stage didn't just threaten the settlement. It pushed water across the entire footprint of the city that was supposed to stand there. So the first construction project in New Orleans was not a house or a church or a government building. It was a wall of earth along the riverfront, built by enslaved African laborers piling mud by hand to hold the water back. Those first levees were no more than a couple of feet high. Every serious flood washed sections of them out. They built them back. The flood came again. They built them back again. Behind the levees, the standing water had to go somewhere. Workers cut channels and drainage ditches through the settlement, pushing water toward the lower ground at the back of the site. The heat was brutal. The water was contaminated. The mosquitoes were constant. Workers died at a pace that alarmed colonial administrators in France, who were receiving reports that seemed almost too bad to be true. Construction stopped repeatedly when labor ran out. Progress made over weeks was erased by a single bad storm in an afternoon. What they built in those first years reflected all of that uncertainty. Simple wooden structures raised on posts above the ground so moisture couldn't rot the floors from below. No stone. There was none locally available. Brick was scarce. By the early 1720s, New Orleans was a loose scattering of wooden cabins, storage sheds, and a few administrative buildings huddled near the riverfront. It looked less like a city than like a work camp that hadn't yet decided whether it was staying. In 1721, the French colonial administration sent an engineer named Adrien de Pauger to give the settlement a formal plan. What de Pauger completed in 1722 was a precise rectangular street grid, 66 blocks arranged in a neat pattern with the river to the south and open ground to the north. He oriented the entire grid diagonally relative to the surrounding land, aligning it instead with the natural levee that the Mississippi itself had built up along its bank over centuries, the highest and most stable ground on the site. The centerpiece of the plan was a large open square he placed directly facing the river, the Place d'Armes. Around it, he arranged a church, a government building, and a jail. The surrounding blocks were divided and assigned to colonists, merchants, religious orders, and military units. Streets were named after French royalty and nobility: Bourbon Street, Royal Street, Chartres Street, Dauphine Street. The whole grid measured roughly 11 blocks long and 6 blocks deep. This layout became what we now call the French Quarter, or Vieux Carre, meaning Old Square. It was not built all at once. It filled in block by block over decades as the population grew and the drainage gradually improved. But the street pattern that Depouge drew in 1722 is still the street pattern of the French Quarter today. Every turn, every intersection, every alley follows the lines he put on paper more than 300 years ago. The 1722 plan also introduced the first legally enforced levee maintenance requirement. Property holders along the river were required to keep the embankments in front of their land in good repair. The colonial government understood by now that the levees were not a construction project to be finished and forgotten, but a permanent, ongoing obligation that the city could never stop meeting. New Orleans did not get a period of calm to establish itself. A major hurricane struck in 1722, just 4 years after founding, and tore through the wood frame settlement almost entirely. The church was gone, housing collapsed, crops were ruined. Some colonial officials openly questioned whether the location could support a city at all. Flooding was a constant. The levees improved slowly, and slowly meant that every serious rainy season brought water into the back portions of the grid, where the ground was lowest. The colonial administration brought in additional enslaved laborers throughout the 1720s and 1730s, specifically to expand the levee and canal system. The physical infrastructure of early New Orleans was built almost entirely on that forced labor. By the 1740s, the city had stabilized enough to function. Warehouses lined the riverfront. The grid had filled in considerably. The population had grown to several thousand. French colonists, German immigrants, enslaved Africans, freed people of color, and Native American traders. Not yet a major city by European standards, but a real one. On March 21st, 1788, a fire started in the home of a Spanish military official on Chartres Street, in the heart of the French Quarter. The wind was blowing hard across the settlement that afternoon. The buildings were wood, the streets were narrow, and the city's firefighting equipment was essentially inadequate for what was about to happen. Now, while I was researching this, I found one detail I couldn't move past. March 21st, 1788 was Good Friday. The priests refused to ring the church bells as a fire alarm out of religious observance. I want you to sit with that for a second. The city is on fire. The bells are right there. And nobody rang them, so the city burned for 5 hours before most people even knew. That one stopped me cold. The fire moved through the Vieux Carre with almost nothing to stop it. Within hours, it had jumped from block to block across the grid that Depouge had drawn 66 years earlier. By the time it burned out, 856 buildings had been destroyed. That figure represented close to the entire settled city. The church on the Place d'Armes was gone. The government buildings were gone. Most of the residential blocks of the French Quarter were ash and scorched timber. The Great New Orleans Fire of 1788 destroyed in a single afternoon the majority of everything French colonial builders had put up over 7 decades. The Reconstruction that followed would change the city permanently. And the people who built the new New Orleans were not French. France had secretly ceded Louisiana to Spain in 1762 through the Treaty of Fontainebleau. The French population of New Orleans did not receive the news for 2 years, and when it arrived, many resisted. A revolt was crushed in 1769 when Governor Alejandro O'Reilly arrived with 2,000 soldiers, executed the uprising's leaders, and made clear that Spanish rule was not negotiable. The city that Spanish governors inherited was almost entirely wood, and the fire of 1788 had just demonstrated what that meant. Reconstruction was financed and directed under Governor Esteban Rodriguez Miro, and it went up in an entirely different material. The new buildings across the French Quarter were brick, plastered with stucco, with thick masonry walls built to survive what wooden construction obviously could not. The style was Spanish colonial. Buildings pushed to the edge of the street, arched ground floor arcades for shade, interior courtyards hidden behind the street-facing walls. Iron lacework balconies appeared on the upper floors, anchored into the new brick construction. Governor Francisco Luis Hector de Carondelet, who took office in 1791, continued the rebuilding effort and pushed further. He ordered major improvements to the levee system, extended drainage canals outward from the grid, introduced the city's first street lighting, and organized a night watch force, the basic infrastructure of a functioning city rather than just a surviving one. The Cabildo, the Spanish administrative building on the Plaza de Armas, was completed in 1799. The St. Louis Cathedral was rebuilt on the same square and completed in 1794, larger and more formally designed than anything that had stood before it. Together, they gave the central square an architectural permanence it had always lacked. Before the reconstruction from the 1788 fire was even complete, New Orleans burned again. On December 8, 1794, a second major fire destroyed approximately 212 buildings in the northern portion of the French Quarter, the section that the first fire had mostly spared. The pattern was the same: wooden structures, dry conditions, inadequate containment. The Spanish rebuilt again. And after 2 fires in 6 years, brick became the dominant construction material for new buildings across the entire settled grid. The New Orleans that existed by the end of the 1790s was a largely masonry city. Its streets lined with the thick-walled Spanish colonial buildings that would define the visual character of the Vieux Carre long after Spanish rule had ended. It is one of the more unusual facts in American urban history that the neighborhood called the French Quarter is, architecturally, almost entirely the product of Spanish colonial reconstruction. I genuinely had to read that twice during my research. Every tourist photograph of the French Quarter is a photograph of Spanish buildings. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte negotiated the return of Louisiana to France through the Treaty of San Ildefonso. The French had never entirely accepted the loss of the territory, and Napoleon had plans for a French empire in the Western Hemisphere, with New Orleans as its commercial foundation. Those plans came apart quickly. A revolution in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, led by enslaved people who had studied the same revolutionary principles France had broadcast to the world in 1789, resulted in the independent nation of Haiti by 1804. The army Napoleon sent to the Caribbean was devastated, partly by combat and partly by yellow fever. The possibility of another war with Britain made it too costly and difficult to keep faraway colonies under control. By 1803, Napoleon had made his decision. The negotiations were rapid. On April 30th, 1803, the United States agreed to purchase the entire Louisiana territory from France for approximately $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre. On December 20th, 1803, the formal transfer ceremony took place in New Orleans. France had held the city again for barely 20 days. The American flag went up over the same Place d'Armes, where French and Spanish flags had flown before it. The United States had acquired something it did not fully understand. New Orleans in 1803 was the largest city in what would become the American South, a port commanding access to the entire Mississippi River Valley and all the trade flowing through it. Its streets followed a plan drawn in 1722. Its buildings were Spanish colonial brick. Its population spoke French, Spanish, and a half-dozen other languages, and its legal and cultural systems had more in common with the Caribbean than with the Eastern American seaboard. The ground beneath all of it was still sinking, still subject to the floods that had shaped the city from its first days. Bienville had chosen this swamp in 1718 because it sat at the intersection of everything that mattered for trade and movement through the continent. 85 years of fires, hurricanes, failed levees, colonial transfers, and forced reconstruction had not changed that fundamental fact. If anything, they had made it more apparent. The city survived because the location demanded a city, and no amount of difficult ground was going to change that. By the time the American flag went up in December 1803, New Orleans was a compact but fully formed city. The settled area was still largely confined to DePauger's original grid. roughly 11 blocks running parallel to the river and 6 blocks deep. The riverfront was the busiest edge, a continuous line of warehouses, wharves, and loading docks where flatboats and ships crowded the bank. Behind it, the streets of the Vieux Carre were narrow, unpaved, and lined almost entirely with the 2- and 3-story Spanish colonial buildings that had gone up after the fires. The ground floors of many buildings were given over to commerce. The upper floors were residential. Interior courtyards, invisible from the street, held gardens, wells, and outbuildings. The Place d'Armes anchored the whole grid, with the Cabildo, the St. Louis Cathedral, and the Presbytère forming a solid masonry wall along its northern edge. The levee along the Mississippi was several feet high by this point, wide enough to walk along the top. Behind the settled grid, drainage canals pushed outward toward Lake Pontchartrain. Beyond them, the cypress swamp began immediately, unchanged from what Bienville had found 85 years earlier. 85 years, 3 colonial flags, 2 fires that destroyed over 1,000 buildings combined, 1 street grid drawn in 1722 that has never been moved or changed, and a $15 million land deal that handed the whole thing to a country that had no idea what it was getting. What started as a French officer pointing at a swamp became the most strategically important city in North America. The ground was wrong, the climate was brutal, the fires kept coming, and every single time they rebuilt it, slightly more permanent than before. If this city's story got under your skin the way it got under mine, hit subscribe. There are plenty more stories like this one waiting for you. See you in the next one.